The Downing Street years as I lived them. Even before the figures were announced by the tellers, we on the opposition benches knew that Jim Callaghan's Labour government had lost its motion of confidence and would have to call a general election. A great burst of cheering and laughter rose from the Tory benches, and Dennis, who was watching the result from the opposition box on the floor of the House, shouted hooray, and was quite properly reproved by an official on the staff of the Sergeant-at-Arms. We had known the figures would be close, but we had not known how close, as on the 28th of March 1979, James Callaghan's Labour government, the last Labour government, and possibly the last ever, fell from office. The obsequies across the dispatch box were brief and almost formal. A slight sense of anticlimax took hold of MPs. The Commons was for the moment no longer the centre of events. The great questions of power and principle would be decided elsewhere. Driving back to my home in Flood Street, Chelsea, with Dennis, I reflected on the coming battle. We had a fight on our hands, of course, but barring accidents, it was a fight we should be able to win. No theory of government was given a fairer test or a more prolonged experiment in a democratic country than democratic socialism received in Britain. Yet it was a miserable failure in every respect. Far from reversing the slow relative decline of Britain compared with its main industrial competitors, it accelerated it. We fell further behind them, until by 1979 we were widely dismissed as the sick man of Europe. The relative worsening of our economic position was disguised by the rising affluence of the West as a whole. But if we never had it so good, others, like Germany, France, Italy, Denmark, increasingly had it better. And as the 1970s wore grimly on, we began to fail in absolute as well as relative terms. Injections of monetary demand went directly into high rates of inflation, without so much as a blip on the charts for production and unemployment. State subsidies achieved progressively more inefficient industries. Laws giving protective immunity to the trade unions at the turn of the century were now abused to protect restrictive practices and overmanning, to underpin strikes, and to coerce workers into joining unions and participating in industrial action against their better judgment. Welfare benefits, distributed with little consideration of their effects on behavior, encouraged illegitimacy, facilitated the breakdown of families, and replaced incentives favoring work and self-reliance with perverse encouragement for idleness and cheating. The final illusion that state intervention would promote social harmony and solidarity collapsed in the winter of discontent, when the dead went unburied, critically ill patients were turned away from hospitals by pickets, and the prevailing mood was one of snarling envy and motiveless hostility. To cure the British disease with socialism was like trying to cure leukemia with leeches. Another approach was needed, and for international reasons as well as domestic ones. Britain's weakened economic position meant that its international role was cramped and strained as well. Comic opera enterprises, such as Harold Wilson's invasion of Anguilla in March 1969, were gleefully seized upon as illustrating the reduced British power. The truth that Britain was a middle-ranking power, given unusual influence by virtue of its historical distinction, skilled diplomacy, and versatile military forces, but greatly weakened by economic decline, seemed too complex for sophisticated people to grasp. What made this more dangerous in the late 1970s was that the United States was undergoing a similar crisis of morale following its failure in Vietnam. Hobbled by its psychological constraint, two presidents saw the Soviet Union and its surrogates expand their power and influence in Afghanistan, Southern Africa, and Central America by subversion and outright military invasion. In Europe, An increasingly self-confident Soviet Union was planting offensive missiles in its eastern satellites and building its conventional forces to levels far in excess of NATO equivalents. It was also constructing a navy that would give it global reach. A theory, coined after the collapse of communism to justify the policy of doves in the Cold War, holds that because the Soviet Union was comparatively weak in the late 1980s, after almost a decade of Western economic and military revival, it must have been a hollow threat in the 1970s. Quite apart from the logical absurdity of placing a cause after its effect, the history of the Soviet Union from 1917 until just the other day refutes this argument. The Soviet Union was a power which deliberately inflicted economic backwardness on itself for political and ideological reasons, but compensated for this by concentrating resources on its military sector and by using the power this gave it to obtain further resources by force or the threat of force. Taken together, these three challenges, long-term economic decline, the debilitating effects of socialism, and the growing Soviet threat, were an intimidating inheritance for a new Prime Minister. I ought perhaps to have been more cowed by them in my imagination than in fact I was as we drove back to Flood Street. The emotion I felt was exhilaration at the challenge. Some of this exhilaration came from meeting a wide range of my fellow countrymen in 4 years as opposition leader. They were so much better than the statistics said. More energetic, more independent, more restive at the decline of the country, and more ready than many of my parliamentary colleagues to support painful measures to reverse that decline. I sensed that a sea change had occurred in the political sensibility of the British people. They had given up on socialism and were ready to try something else. That sea change was our mandate. And there was a more personal factor. Chatham, Prime Minister from 1766 to 68, famously remarked, "I know that I can save this country and that no one else can." It would have been presumptuous of me to have compared myself to Chatham, but if I'm honest, I must admit that my exhilaration came from a similar conviction. My background and experience were not those of a traditional Conservative Prime Minister. I was less able to depend on automatic deference, but I did not feel I needed an interpreter to address people who spoke the same language. And I felt it was a real advantage that we had lived the same sort of life. I had grown up in a household that was neither poor nor rich. We had to economize each day in order to enjoy the occasional luxury. My father's background as a grocer is sometimes cited as the basis for my economic philosophy. So it was, and is. My father was both a practical man and a man of theory. He liked to connect the progress of our corner shop with the great complex romance of international trade, which recruited people from all over the world to ensure that a family in Grantham could have on its table rice from India, coffee from Kenya, sugar from the West Indies, and spices from 5 continents. Before I read a line from the great liberal economists, I knew from my father's accounts that the free market was like a vast sensitive nervous system, responding to events and signals all over the world to meet the ever-changing needs of peoples in different countries with a kind of benign indifference to their status. Governments acted on a much smaller store of conscious information and, by contrast, were themselves blind forces blundering about in the dark and obstructing the operations of markets rather than improving them. The economic history of Britain for the next 40 years confirmed and amplified almost every item of my father's practical economics. In effect, I had been equipped at an early age with the ideal mental outlook and tools of analysis for reconstructing an economy ravaged by state socialism. My life, like those of most people on the planet, was transformed by the Second World War. I drew from the failure of appeasement, the lesson that aggression must always be firmly resisted. But how? My view was, and is, that an effective internationalism can only be built by strong nations which are able to call upon the loyalty of their citizens to defend and enforce civilized rules of international conduct. An internationalism which seeks to supersede the nation-state, however, will founder quickly upon the reality that very few people are prepared to make genuine sacrifices for it. It is likely to degenerate, therefore, into a formula for endless discussion and hand-wringing. I held these conclusions very tentatively at the war's end, but they hardened into firm convictions in the 1940s and 1950s, when, in the face of the Soviet threat, those institutions like NATO, which represented international cooperation between strong nation-states, proved far more effective in resisting that threat than bodies like the United Nations, which embodied a superficially more ambitious, but in reality weaker, internationalism. I was preoccupied by these reflections as we drove home, had a small family celebration at Flood Street, and finally turned in for the night. My last thought was, the die is cast. If honest endeavor were the test, we would not fail. In the end, however, man proposes and God disposes. We might deserve success, but we could not command it. It was, perversely, a comforting thought. I slept well. At about 2:45, on Friday, the 4th of May, I walked out of Conservative Central Office, through a crowd of supporters, and into the waiting car, which drove Dennis and me to the palace on my last journey as leader of the opposition. The audience at which one receives the Queen's authority to form a government comes to most prime ministers only once in a lifetime. The authority is unbroken when a sitting prime minister wins an election, and so it never had to be renewed throughout the years I was in office. All audiences with the Queen take place in strict confidence, and I was to have such audiences with Her Majesty once a week, usually on a Tuesday when she was in London, and sometimes elsewhere when the royal family were at Windsor or Balmoral. Perhaps it is permissible to make just 2 points about these meetings. Anyone who imagines that they are a mere formality is quite wrong. They are quietly businesslike, and Her Majesty brings to bear a formidable grasp of current issues and a great breadth of experience. And although the press could not resist the temptation to suggest disputes between the Palace and Downing Street, especially on Commonwealth affairs, I always found the Queen's attitude towards the work of government absolutely correct. Of course, stories of clashes between two powerful women were just too good not to make up. In general, more nonsense was written about the so-called feminine factor during my time in office than about almost anything else. I was always being asked how it felt to be a woman Prime Minister. I would reply, I don't know. I've never experienced the alternative. Dennis and I left Buckingham Palace in the Prime Ministerial car. My previous car had already gone to Mr. Callahan. In those innocent days before security had become so much tighter for fear of terrorism, crowds of well-wishers, sightseers, press and camera crews were waiting for us in Downing Street, and the crowds extended into Whitehall. Dennis and I got out of the car and walked towards them. When we turned to the cameras and reporters, the cheers were so deafening that no one in the street could hear what I was saying. Fortunately, the microphones thrust in front of me picked it up and carried it over the radio and television. I quoted a famous prayer attributed to St. Francis of Assisi, beginning, "Where there is discord, may we bring harmony." Afterwards, a good deal of sarcasm was expended on this choice, but the rest of the quotation is often forgotten. St. Francis prayed for more than peace. The prayer goes on, "Where there is error, may we bring truth. Where there is despair, may we bring hope. The forces of error, doubt and despair were so firmly entrenched in British society, as the winter of discontent had just powerfully illustrated, that overcoming them would not be possible without some measure of discord. Inside number 10, all the staff had turned out to welcome us. The number of staff is relatively small, a total of between 70 or 80, though because of the shift system, not all will be there at one time. That figure comprises those working in the private office, including the duty clerks, who ensure that number 10 is able to operate round the clock. The press office, where someone is also always on call. The garden room girls, who do the secretarial and paperwork. Confidential filing, which sorts and files the enormous accumulations of documents. The parliamentary section, which deals with parliamentary questions, statements and debates. The correspondence section, where some 4,000 to 7,000 letters are received every week. The section which deals with church matters and with honours. The political office and the policy unit. And the messengers and other staff who keep the whole extended family supplied with tea and coffee, and above all, information from the outside world. It is an extraordinary achievement, and it requires people of unusual qualities and commitment, not least when you compare these relatively slender resources and modest surroundings with, for example, the White House with its 400 staff, or the German Chancellery with 500. The Prime Minister's private secretaries, headed by the Principal Private Secretary, are crucial to the effective conduct of government. They are the main channel of communication between the Prime Minister and the rest of Whitehall, and they bear a heavy burden of responsibility. I was fortunate to have a succession of superb Principal Private Secretaries over the years. Bernard Ingham, my press secretary, on his arrival 5 months after I became Prime Minister, was another indispensable member of the team. I was told that Bernard's politics had been Labour, not Conservative, but I warmed to this tough, blunt, humorous Yorkshireman the first time I met him. An honest man himself, he expected the same high standards from others. He never let me down. The hours at number 10 are long. I never minded this. There was an intensity about the job of being Prime Minister which made sleep seem a luxury. The private office, too, would often be working till 11 o'clock at night. We were so few that there was no possibility of putting work on someone else's desk. This sort of atmosphere helps to produce a remarkably happy team, as well as a formidably efficient one. People are under great pressure, and there is no time for trivia. Mutual respect and friendly relations are often the result. The cheers and clapping when a new Prime Minister arrives may be a traditional formality, but the tears and regrets when the outgoing Prime Minister makes his or her final departure are usually genuine. Number 10 is more than an office. It is intended to serve as the Prime Minister's home, and as we used to say, harking back to my girlhood in Grantham, I liked living over the shop. The flat at number 10 quickly became a refuge from the rest of the world, though on occasion a good deal of business was done there too. Dennis and I decided that we would not have any living-in domestic help. No housekeeper could possibly have coped with the irregular hours we kept. When I had no other engagement, I would go up to the flat for a quick lunch of salad or poached egg on Bovril toast. But usually it was 10 or 11 o'clock at night, when I would go into the kitchen and prepare something. We knew every way in which eggs and cheese could be served, and there was always something to cut at in the fridge. Our Dennis poured me a nightcap. Prime Minister or not, I never forgot that I was also MP for Finchley and Frown Barnet. My monthly surgeries, or interview evenings as they are called, in the constituency, and the correspondence which was dealt with from my number 10 office by my secretary, Joy Robiliard, kept me directly in touch with people's worries. I always had the benefit of a first-class constituency agent and a strongly supportive constituency chairman, which, as any MP knows, makes a world of difference. I could never have been Prime Minister for more than 11 years without Dennis at my side. Always a powerful personality, he had very definite ideas about what should and should not be done. He was fond of shrewd advice and penetrating comment, and he very sensibly saved these for me rather than the outside world, always refusing to give interviews. He never had a secretary or public relations advisor, but answered something like 30 to 50 letters every week in his own hand. With the appearance of the Dear Bill letters in Private Eye, he seemed to become half the nation's favorite correspondent. Dennis shared my fascination with politics. That, of course, is how we first met. But he also had his own outside interests, not least sport. He was heavily involved in charities, an active member of the Sports Aid Foundation and of the Lord's Taverners. Dennis delivered many speeches on his favorite non-political subjects. The one which for me best summed up his character and convictions was on sport and ethics, and contained these lines: "The desire to win is born in most of us. The will to win is a matter of training. The manner of winning is a matter of honor." Although Dennis, by choice, would have stayed in the army at the end of World War II, the unexpected death of his father left him with no option but to return to run the family business, a paint and chemicals company. I'm glad he did, for his industrial experience was invaluable to me. Not only was he familiar with the scientific side, something which we had in common, but he was also a crack cost and management accountant. Nothing escaped his professional eye. He could see and sense trouble long before anyone else. His knowledge of the oil industry also gave me immediate access to expert advice when, in 1979, the world experienced the second sudden oil price increase. Indeed, through him and our many friends, I was never out of touch with industry and commerce. Being Prime Minister is a lonely job. In a sense, it ought to be. You can't lead from the crowd. But with Dennis there, I was never alone. What a man. What a husband. What a friend. On this first evening, I entered the cabinet room, where I was greeted by familiar faces, among them my daughter Carol. There was Richard Ryder, my political secretary, responsible for keeping me in touch with the Conservative Party in the country. David Wolfson, now Lord Wolfson, who acted as my chief of staff, bringing to bear his charm and business experience on the problems of running Number 10. Caroline Stevens, later to become Caroline Ryder, who became my diary secretary. Alison Ward, later Alison Wakeham, my constituency secretary. And Cynthia Crawford, known to all of us as Crawfie, who acted as my personal assistant and who has stayed with me ever since. We didn't waste much time in conversation. They were anxious to sort out who was to go to what office. I had a similar task in mind, the choice of my cabinet. Choosing a cabinet is undoubtedly one of the most important ways in which a Prime Minister can exercise power over the whole conduct of government. But it's not always understood how real are the constraints under which the choices take place. One has to achieve distribution across the country. Every region is easily convinced it has been left out. And you must also consider the spectrum of party opinion. Even so, the press expect the cabinet of some 22 ministers to be appointed and the list to be published within about 24 hours. Otherwise it is taken as a sure sign of some sort of political crisis. So I received the usual detailed security briefing which is given to incoming Prime Ministers. Then I went upstairs to the study, accompanied by Willie Whitelaw and our new Chief Whip, Michael Jopling. We began to sift through the obvious and less obvious names, and slowly this most perplexing of jigsaws began to take shape. While Willie Whitelaw, the Chief Whip, and I discussed the appointments to the Cabinet, Ken Stowe, my principal private secretary, sought to contact those involved to arrange for them to come in the next day. At 8:30 in the evening, we took a break for a meal. My personal staff brought in a Chinese meal from a takeaway, and some 15 of us sat down to eat in the large dining room. I knew that the hardest battles would be fought on the ground of economic policy, so I made sure that the key economic ministers would be true believers in our economic strategy. Geoffrey Howe had shown that beneath a deceptively mild exterior, he had the makings of the fine chancellor he was to become. Some of the toughest decisions were to fall on him. He never flinched. In my view, these were his best political years. After becoming leader in 1975, I had considered appointing Keith Joseph as Shadow Chancellor. Keith is one of the best minds in politics, an original thinker who makes you understand what Burke meant when he wrote of politics being philosophy in action. He's rare in another way, too. He combines humility, open-mindedness, and unshakable principle. He is deeply and genuinely sensitive to people's misfortunes. Although he had no doubt of the rightness of the decisions which we were to make, he knew that they meant that unviable firms would collapse and overmanning become unemployment. And he cared about those who were affected far more than did all our professionally compassionate critics. But such a combination of personal qualities may create difficulties in the cruel hurly-burly of political life, which chancellors above all must endure. So Keith took over at Industry, where he changed the whole philosophy which had previously dominated that department. Keith was and remains my closest political friend. John Biffin I appointed Chief Secretary to the Treasury. He had been a brilliant exponent in opposition, but he proved rather less effective than I had hoped in the grueling task of trying to control public expenditure. His later performance as leader of the House was far happier. John Knott became Secretary of State for Trade. He, too, had a clear understanding of and commitment to our policies of monetary control, low taxes, and free enterprise. But John is a mixture of gold, dross, and mercury. No one was better at analyzing a situation and prescribing a policy to deal with it. Yet he found it hard, or perhaps boring, to stick with the policy once it had been firmly decided. His vice was second thoughts. Willie Whitelaw became Home Secretary, and in that capacity, and later as Leader of the Lords, he provided me personally and the government as a whole with shrewd advice based on massive experience. People were often surprised that the two of us worked so well together, given our rivalry for the leadership and our different outlook on economics. But Willie is a big man in character as well as physically. Once he had pledged his loyalty, he never withdrew it. He supported me steadfastly when I was right, and more important, when I wasn't. He was an irreplaceable Deputy Prime Minister, an office which has no constitutional existence, but is a clear sign of political precedence and the ballast that helped keep government on course. I brought in the formidable Christopher Soames to be leader of the House of Lords. Christopher was his own man, indeed excessively so, and thus better suited to solo performances than to working in harmony with others. Peter Carrington, who'd led the Lords skillfully in opposition, became Foreign Secretary. His unrivaled experience of foreign affairs more than qualified him for the job. We had disagreements, but there were never any hard feelings. I was determined, however, that at least one Foreign Office minister should have a good grounding in and sound views on economic policy. I had Peter bring in Nick Ridley. Two other appointments excited more comment. To his surprise, I asked Peter Walker to be Agriculture Minister. Peter had never made a secret of his hostility to my economic strategy, but he was both tough and persuasive, priceless assets in dealing with the plain absurdities of the European Community's common agricultural policy. His membership of the cabinet demonstrated that I was prepared to include every strand of conservative opinion in the new government, and his post that I was not prepared to put the central economic strategy at risk. That was perhaps less clear in my decision to keep Jim Pryor on at employment. During opposition, and running on from that time, there was a lively argument about trade union reform. We all agreed that trade unions had acquired far too many powers and privileges. We also agreed that these must be dealt with one step at a time. But when it came down to specific measures, there was a deep disagreement about how fast and how far to move. Yet there was no doubt in my mind that we needed Jim Pryor. There was still the feeling in the country, and indeed in the Conservative Party, that Britain could not be governed without the tacit consent of the trade unions. Jim was the badge of our reasonableness. He had forged good relations with a number of trade union leaders whose practical value he perhaps overestimated. But he was an experienced politician and a strong personality, qualities he subsequently demonstrated to great effect in Northern Ireland. By about 11 p.m., the list of the cabinet was complete and had been approved by the Queen. I went upstairs to thank the number 10 telefonists who had had a busy time arranging all the appointments for the following day. On Saturday night, we completed the list of junior ministers, and I saw or telephoned them on Sunday. Many of these would later enter cabinet, including Cecil Parkinson, Norman Tebbit, Nick Ridley, and John Wakeham. There were some 60 posts to be filled, but the whole government had been appointed and announced within 48 hours of my entering Downing Street. My last and best appointment was of Ian Gow as my Parliamentary Private Secretary, or PPS. Ian's combination of loyalty, shrewdness, and irrepressible sense of fun was to see us all through many difficult moments. He was an instinctive parliamentarian who loved every aspect of the House of Commons. In private conversation, he had the ability to draw everyone into the political circle and make them feel theirs was the vital contribution. In public, his speeches were marked by a deadpan humour which could reduce both sides of the House to tears of laughter. We remained close friends after Ian's principled resignation over the Anglo-Irish Agreement, which he opposed from a standpoint of undiluted unionism. His murder by IRA terrorists in 1990 was an irreplaceable loss. On Tuesday, at 2:30 p.m., we held our first cabinet meeting. At that first informal cabinet, we began the painful but necessary process of shrinking down the public sector. We imposed an immediate freeze on all civil service recruitment and started a review of the controls imposed by central on local government, though here we would in due course be forced down the path of applying still tougher financial controls, as the inability or refusal of local councils to run services efficiently became increasingly apparent. Pay and prices were an immediate concern. Professor Hugh Clegg's Commission on Pay Comparability had been appointed by the Labour government as a respectable means of bribing public sector workers not to strike with post-dated cheques due to be presented after the election. The Clegg Commission was a major headache, and the pain became steadily more acute as the cheques fell due. As regards pay bargaining in the nationalised industries, our strategy would be to apply the necessary financial discipline and then let the management and unions directly involved make their own decisions. But that would require progress in complementary areas, competition, privatisation, and trade union reform, before it was to show results. There would also have to be a fundamental overhaul of the way in which prices were controlled by such interventionist measures as the Price Commission, government pressure, and subsidy. We were under no illusion. Price rises were a symptom of underlying inflation, not a cause of it. Inflation was a monetary phenomenon which it would require monetary discipline to curb. In all this activity of government making and policy setting, I knew that I could not afford to neglect the backbenchers. So on Tuesday evening, Before Parliament assembled the following day, I invited the chairman and officers of the 1922 committee for a talk to celebrate our victory and discuss the work of the coming parliamentary session. Wednesday, the 9th of May, saw the new Parliament assemble for the election of the Speaker. The Speaker of the previous Parliament had been George Thomas, a former Labour cabinet minister, and he was the unanimous choice to continue in that office. My respect for George Thomas, already great, was to grow over the years. He was a deeply committed Christian with a shining integrity, but in my speech of congratulation, something else was on my mind. I had to keep remembering not to refer to Jim Callaghan as Prime Minister. To turn from the euphoria of election victory to the problems of the British economy was to confront the morning after the night before. Inflation was speeding up, public sector pay was out of control, public spending projections were rising as revenue projections fell, and our domestic problems were aggravated by a rise in oil prices that was driving the world into recession. Our first opportunity to demonstrate that we would not be deterred by the difficulties was the Queen's speech. The first loyal address of a new government sets the tone for its whole term of office. If the opportunity to set a radical new course is not taken, it will almost certainly never occur. And the world realizes that underneath all the brave new rhetoric, it is business as usual. I was determined to send out a clear signal of change. By the end of the debates on the address, it was evident that the House of Commons could expect a heavy programme designed to reverse socialism, extend choice, and widen property ownership. There would be legislation to restrict the activities of Labour's National Enterprise Board and to begin the process of returning state-owned businesses and assets to the private sector. We would give council tenants the right to buy their homes at large discounts, with the possibility of 100% mortgages. There would be partial deregulation of new private sector renting. We would repeal Labour's Community Land Act. This had created a shortage of land and pushed up prices. We removed the obligation on local authorities to replace grammar schools and announced the introduction of the Assisted Places scheme, enabling talented children from poorer backgrounds to go to private schools. These were the first of what I hoped would be many steps to ensure that children from families like my own had the chance of self-improvement. We would, finally, curb what were often the corrupt and wasteful activities of local government direct labour organisations, usually socialist-controlled. When I spoke in the Queen's Speech debate, 2 points attracted particular attention: the abolition of price controls and the promise of trade union reform. There was plenty of evidence gathered by the Confederation of British Industry that while price controls had a minimal effect on inflation, they damaged industrial profitability and investment. John Knott, the Trade Secretary, was keen to act swiftly, and he was right. It would have been more difficult to abolish the Price Commission later in the year when prices were already rising faster. On our trade union reforms, Jim Pryor's preferred strategy was one of consultation with the trade unions before introducing the limited reforms of trade union law, which we had proposed in opposition. But initially, we proposed 3 reforms in the Queen's Speech. First, the right to picket, which had been so seriously abused, would be strictly limited to those in dispute with their employer at their own place of work. Thus, secondary picketing would become unlawful. Second, we were committed to changing the law on the closed shop, under which employees had effectively been compelled to join a union if they wished to obtain or keep a job. At that time, this covered some 5 million workers. Third, public funds would be made available to finance postal ballots. We wanted to discourage votes by show of hands, the notorious car park votes, and the sharp practice, rigging and intimidation which had become associated with trade union democracy. In retrospect, it seems extraordinary that such a relatively modest programme was represented by most trade union leaders and the Labour Party as an outright attack on trade unionism. In fact, we would have to return, and soon, to the issue of trade union reform. Not only did we have huge public support for our policies, but the majority of trade unionists supported them too, because their families were being damaged by strikes, which many of them had not voted for and did not want. We were the ones in touch with the popular mood. This was my first major parliamentary performance as Prime Minister, and I emerged unscathed. Nowadays, Prime Ministers make relatively few speeches in the House. This may be one reason why it is often difficult, over and above the moral blow of losing an election and leaving office, for Prime Ministers to revert to becoming leaders of the opposition, a job which demands more speech-making, but with less thorough briefing. However, it is questions to the Prime Minister every Tuesday and Thursday which are the real test of your authority in the House, your standing with your party, and your grip of policy and of the facts to justify it. No head of government anywhere in the world has to face this sort of regular pressure, and many go to great lengths to avoid it. No head of government, as I would sometimes remind those at summits, is as accountable to Parliament as the British Prime Minister. I always brief myself very carefully for questions. One of the private secretaries, my political secretary, my parliamentary private secretary, and I would go through all the likely issues which might come up without any notice. This is because the questions on the order paper only ask about the Prime Minister's official engagements for that day. The real question is the supplementary, whose subject matter may vary from some local hospital to a great international issue or to the crime statistics. Each department was, naturally, expected to provide the facts and a possible reply on points which might arise. It was a good test of the alertness and efficiency of the cabinet minister in charge of a department whether the information arrived late or arrived at all, whether it was accurate or wrong, comprehensible or riddled with jargon. On occasion, the results judged by these criteria were not altogether reassuring. However, little by little, I came to feel more confident about these noisy ritual confrontations, and as I did so, my performance became more effective. Sometimes I even enjoyed them. The second half of 1979, though dominated by economic policy and by the intense round of diplomatic activity, was also a time darkened by terrorism. Barely a fortnight after entering number 10, I had delivered the eulogy at the memorial service for Eri Neve, and I was at Chequers for the bank holiday Monday of the 27th of August, when Lord Mountbatten was murdered by an explosion on board his boat off the coast of Mullaghmore, County Sligo. 3 other members of his party were killed, and 3 injured. In an even greater defiance of civilized custom, 18 of our soldiers were killed and 5 injured in a double explosion triggered by remote-controlled devices at Warren Point. The IRA had exploded the first bomb and then waited for those who came by helicopter to rescue their comrades before detonating the second. Among those murdered by the second bomb was a commanding officer of the Queen's Own Highlanders. Words were always inadequate to condemn this kind of outrage. I decided immediately that I must go to Northern Ireland to show the army, police and civilians that I understood the scale of the tragedy and to demonstrate our determination to resist terrorism. On Tuesday evening, I wrote personally to the families of the soldiers who had died. Such letters are not easy to write. There were, alas, to be many more of them during my time in office. I flew to Ulster on Wednesday morning. For security reasons, the visit was given no prior publicity. I went first to the Musgrove Park Hospital in Belfast and talked to the injured soldiers. I had insisted that I must meet the ordinary citizens of the city, and since the best way to do so was to walk through Belfast's shopping centre, that is where I went next. I shall never forget the reception I received. It is peculiarly moving to receive good wishes from people who are suffering. I formed then an impression I have never had reason to revise, that the people of Ulster will never bow to violence. After a buffet lunch with soldiers of all ranks from 3 Brigade, I received a briefing from the Army and then departed by helicopter to what is rightly referred to as the bandit country of South Armagh. Dressed in a camouflage jacket, I saw the bomb-battered Crossmaglen RUC station, the most attacked RUC army post in the province, before running back to the helicopter. It is too dangerous for either security force personnel or helicopters to remain stationary in these parts. Back in London, there were 2 major questions. How were we to improve the direction and coordination of our security operations in the province? And how were we to get more cooperation in security matters from the Irish Republic? Accordingly, we arranged a day's talks with the Irish Prime Minister, Jack Lynch, when he arrived in London for Lord Mountbatten's funeral. Mr. Lynch had no positive suggestions of his own to make at all. When I asked that RUC officers be able to attend interrogation of terrorist suspects in the south, he said that they would study it. I knew what that meant. Nothing doing. I asked that we extend the existing arrangements by which our helicopters could overfly the border, across which terrorists seemed able to come and go almost at will. He said they would study that as well. I sought more effective liaison between the RUC and the Garda, and between the British and Irish armies. The same response. At one point, I got so exasperated that I asked whether the Irish government was willing to do anything at all. They agreed to a further meeting, but there was a fatal absence of the political will to take tough measures. However, I was determined to keep up the pressure on the Republic. I could not forget that by the time of my visit to Northern Ireland, 1,152 civilians and 543 members of the security forces had been killed as a result of terrorist action. We also lost no opportunity to use the revulsion the killings provoked in the United States of America to inform public opinion there about the realities of life in Ulster. The emotions and loyalties of millions of decent Irish Americans are manipulated by Irish Republican extremists who've been able to give a romantic respectability to terrorism that its sordid reality belies. As a result, there has been a continuing flow of funds and arms which helps the IRA to continue its campaign. By contrast, in 1979, we were faced with the absurd situation that the purchase of 3,000 revolvers for the RUC was held up by a State Department review under pressure from the Irish Republican lobby in Congress. I visited the province again on Christmas Eve. This time, I met members of the Northern Ireland Prison Service as well as the security forces. For the prison officers, too, faced grave danger and often worked in appalling conditions. 17 prison officers had been murdered in the past 4 years, 7 of them in the previous 3 months. It made the troubles of a political life seem very trivial.